As we get started, as I get started this afternoon, I thought I might tell you about a memory of a particular moment on Hannah and my wedding day. Yeah, that's right. I get to show you wedding pictures. These are from like more than 12 years ago. It was a great day. We had a beautiful church service, and afterwards we had a Korean service, right? I promise you, I was told at least that's like part of the tradition, carrying my wife around on my back, and then asked me to carry my mother around on my back, at which point she politely refused. First of many cross-cultural experiences with our family. And we had a great reception, a great party. There's Hannah's grandmother in the middle of like the dance circle. Hannah's brother just finished breakdancing, and then her like 80-some-year-old grandmother came into the middle. It was back in the day we were raising the roof. It was great. But you know what? The moment I remember most clearly from my wedding day is not the moment that we said our first vows. Honestly, I can't even remember that at all. I found it kind of troubling when I realized that recently. I was like, yeah, I have no idea when that happened. I'm pretty sure we did. I actually have video evidence, I think, that we did. I don't remember the exchange of rings or even the kiss. The clearest memory from that day actually was on the way to the airport from the reception. Hannah was just exhausted in the passenger seat of our car. We're on our way. And I remember her saying, as if her life depended on it, it did not depend on it, but as if her life depended on it, I need water. It's like, okay. We were like in the no man's land between downtown Philadelphia and the airport. And it wasn't an emergency. She was exhausted, but it was clear from the way that she said it that this was definitely something I had to attend to. And I remember thinking, I knew I could do something to get her some water, and so I got off at the next exit. I found a convenience store where somewhere I could go in, and I went in to buy my wife for the first time, buy my wife some water. And I'll never forget coming back to the car, just kind of seeing her splayed out in the front seat, just exhausted from the day. It's exhausting to get married. And I remember thinking, like, okay, now we're married, right? Like, now, like, when my wife needs water, like, I get her water. This is how it goes now. I don't know why, but it hit me at that moment. I was like, now we're married. Like, this is what it's all about. And over the ensuing months, I found that was really so true, actually. In many ways, that moment on the way to the airport, I learned more about marriage than I did from everything that had happened during the ceremony. Not listening to the wonderful homilies in both English and Korean that happened at the wedding ceremony that made for a pretty awesomely long wedding ceremony. But the real stuff of marriage didn't come in spectacular moments. Rather, it happened in the quiet moments of regular life. And this, I quickly found, brought on some challenges. Perhaps you could relate to this. In some ways, it's easier to do the grand gestures. It's harder to be faithful in the small stuff. And so quickly I began to find while I had no problem imagining that I would take a bullet for Hannah, it was much harder for some reason to do the dishes. Sometimes it can seem easier to follow Jesus to the cross than to the laundry room. And this, I think this really is the major challenge that Moses and the people are struggling with this week. Last week, we asked, when we read the story of Moses and the people and the enemies of God, who are we supposed to identify? Are we the people of God, or are we the enemies of God? And we found out, of course, that it turns out, in many ways, we are both. As it turns out, God has but one people. Those who once were God's enemies, whom he nevertheless pursues and loves to set them free, even from their own oppressive practices. But in learning that, we talked about some pretty spectacular stuff in the story that we were looking at. We looked at God setting the people free through the plagues of blood and frogs and flies and animal death and fire and hail and boils and locusts and darkness and the death of the firstborn son. We saw the people depart, pursued by Pharaoh's army to the Red Sea, which God miraculously parted. It was spectacular, fit for Hollywood. This week, the challenge is quite different. This week, in many respects, the spectacular is behind them. As they walk away from the Red Sea, the people are confronted with problems that are much more mundane. Their need for food, for water, for guidance. Needs that aren't crises of the moment, but rather basic questions of sustenance that lead them into questions about who God is and who they are in relationship to God. The questions are no longer about a moment's rescue, but about lifelong provision for the long haul. And the question becomes, can the God who rescued them from Pharaoh in a spectacular blaze of signs and wonders also sustain them through the everyday slog of life in the desert? And so the real challenge for Moses and the people becomes how to build a community that can cultivate trust in God over the long haul, in the unspectacular things, in the regular things of life, in the persistent issues, the nagging things that won't just go away. How do you form a community that reinforces gratitude rather than grumbling, trust instead of fear, faith rather than despair? So that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. What sort of community do we learn that we have to become when we take seriously the peculiar and particular challenge of following God after the spectacular? It's not actually peculiar, that's the normal thing, right? What do we do in following God in the everyday trials of life? What kind of community do we have to become in order to be up to that sort of, actually, in some ways, more difficult task in trusting God for the spectacular? That's where we're headed. As we do that, why don't we begin with prayer? You pray with me. Lord, some of us are here today and we've had spectacular encounters with you. Some of us have heard stories of people who've had rather spectacular encounters with you. I think all of us, Lord, know what it is to just live regular life. Maybe some of us are able to, we're used to kind of seeing you in those things, some of us maybe less so. But Lord, today I ask that you would help us receive from your word just some encouragement for just the regular things of life. We want to be a people, a community formed to be able to follow you for the long haul. So come, Holy Spirit, speak to us, have your way in this place. Amen. So we pick up this afternoon and we join Moses and the people kind of on their way back, or away from, not back from, on their way out from the Red Sea. It says, then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. 3 days. All right, so there's a problem. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. Marah means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what are we to drink? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water. The water became fit to drink. Miraculous. So thus begins Moses' 40-year-long career as a desert tour guide. Or so it would seem, right, from the way that the people interact with him, right? But you can start to get a sense of what is at stake. Fine, right? God led us out of Egypt with signs and wonders. He parted the Red Sea. But let's get down to practical exigencies here of life, right? Like, what are the things I just need? Can God, who parts the Red Sea, also give us a drink? And it goes right on and says, there the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. The text says that God says this to put them to the test, to learn something about the people and how they see him. And part of this statement seems aimed to deal with a possible confusion regarding God's character, right? That odd little bit where he says, like, I'm not going to do that stuff that I did to the Egyptians to you. All of those plagues aren't revelatory of an angry God who can't control his temper. Right? You can imagine that being a confusion you'd want to have dealt with, right? As we said last week, the plagues were the judgment of God against God's enemies. And here, God simply reminds the people, you are my people. If you will be my people, if you will obey, then you will not be under judgment. Rather, you will know me quite differently than did the Egyptians. You will know me as the God who heals, the God who sets you free, the God who is your guide in the desert. This is the test of the desert. This is the test of following God beyond the spectacular into the everyday. This is the heart of the matter. Can we believe that God is the Lord who heals us, who loves us, who is good to us? Can we trust in the goodness of God? You might think that's hardest to believe when the armies of Pharaoh are bearing down on you and you have nowhere to turn. And I don't mean to say that's easy by any means either. But there's something about the immediacy of the moment and the fact that we have nowhere else to turn to. Sometimes a crisis can actually generate trust in us and trust in God. As they say, there are no atheists in foxholes. Maybe it's actually just the opposite, right? What more often threatens to crush our trust in God is not the flood of onrushing crisis, but rather the relentless trickle of everyday worries and concerns. Those nagging problems that persist year after year, that bit of my character that just never seems to change, that cycle of relating that I can't break out of, my recurrent worry about provision, about having enough. These less dramatic, but no less real issues wear us down precisely by their regular recurrence. And before we know it, we're unsure whether God is in fact the Lord who heals us, who provides for us, who sets us free. And the surest sign that our trust has eroded is that we grumble. We complain. There's a whole lot of grumbling going on in this passage today. We're looking at about 2.5 chapters. I promise you, I left some off. Grumbling is worrying because it's symptomatic of our having forgotten who God is for us. It's symptomatic of our wondering, as the people actually say in our passage, is the Lord among us or not? At its worst, grumbling can lead us even to question the value of God's liberating work. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you, Moses, have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Not only do the people pine for their oppression, but now they attribute it to God, right? If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. They attribute their oppression to the Lord rather than to Pharaoh. And so God takes the people's grumbling quite seriously, and the 40 years they spend in the desert is in many ways one long lesson in the goodness of God. Just in our 2.5 chapters today, there is abundant provision, but it's always begun with grumbling. God provides, we saw, water, then bread from heaven, the meat, then water again. It's a desert, so the provision of water is an important thing. But again and again, God provides and proves his trustworthiness. And yet again and again, the people grumble. In fact, one begins to wonder whether the regularity of provision isn't the problem, right? Think about it. Bread from heaven once is a miracle. Bread from heaven every day is like a natural law that you should just you can depend on. You can complain about when it doesn't happen. It makes you wonder, actually, right? How many things in our lives are just like that? God provides so regularly and so abundantly for us that we stop considering the miracle that it is. At any rate, the pattern is clear. God provides, and the people grumble. And God provides, but then the people grumble. And so God provides. And they worry as they question whether or not God, in fact, is the Lord who heals them, the Lord who has their best at heart. And so as I said at the outset, the real challenge becomes, how do you build a community that can cultivate trust in God over the long haul, precisely in circumstances which are basically just being humans, right? Who need things and worry by more or less by nature. How do you build a community that can cultivate trust in God over the long haul? How do you form a community that reinforces gratitude? How do you form a community that knows, that's able to keep reminding itself that in fact the Lord is among them, that the Lord is in fact the Lord who heals us? Answer, it turns out, has everything, I think, to do with leadership. A leadership of a certain sort and a community oriented around leadership in a particular way is key to being the people of God over the long haul. Why do I say this? Well, for one, right after all these stories about, we get this pattern of grumble, provision, grumble, provision, grumble, provision. Then we have a couple of striking stories about leadership. About Moses' leadership, sure. But as we'll see, there's certainly about more than just Moses' leadership as well. The first story is really interesting. I will warn you in advance, there are parts of this that I cannot explain to you. I'm just going to make observations about like a system and how it seems to work, and we'll just roll with it. We can talk later if you have theories on like how this actually works. But what happens is this: seemingly out of nowhere, literally there's like no warning, the Amalekites attack the people as they're wandering in the desert. I'm not going to bother telling you who the Amalekites are because the text doesn't bother telling you who the Amalekites are either, right? Point is, some people are attacking. And this attack is surprised as Moses immediately mobilizes the people into action, right? And so, unlike last time, the plan apparently is not merely to be still and let the Lord fight on their behalf, but lest the people think that they will lose or win on their own merit, God arranges things in a quite unique way. This is the thing I can't explain. God has Moses go up on a hill, presumably to direct the battle from above, and the text says this: as long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. I have no explanation. Presumably, maybe it demonstrates clearly enough, though, right? What we can take from this is it demonstrates clearly enough that God is still the one waging the battle. Moses' staff that he's holding in the air has been a conduit of divine power to this point. That's as much of an explanation I can give you. The next question is, why is Moses' staff a conduit of divine power? That I don't have an answer for. But apparently it all works, right? We can just kind of be pragmatists about this. The hands stay in the air, the battle is won. It's a good thing, it's an important thing, it's a good system, until, of course, when Moses' hands grew tired. So what are they going to do? Well, when Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, all right, so he could sit. Good strategy. And Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. As I said, I'm not going to get into the metaphysics of how all of that worked exactly, but there's an amazing leadership principle there, I think. Because I take it that this strategy actually avoids two rather obvious, but perhaps less excellent possible solutions. These less excellent solutions would be this. First, they don't decide to do away with leadership, right? What I mean is this. They could have decided to just kind of take turns holding the staff. And I don't know if that would have worked. I think probably not. Because again, I don't know how this whole thing works. But the point is that when they saw leadership faltering, they didn't do away with the idea of leadership entirely. And too often, I think we can tend to go this way. And when we do go this way, we do so not without good reason, right? We've all dealt with leaders who fail and cause serious pain and hardship, leaders who aren't up for the task, or leaders who abuse their power. And these are real problems, no doubt, that need to be dealt with. And so please, you need to hear, I'm going to say some rather strong things about like how a community should work. And don't hear anything I'm saying as a defense of bad, unresponsive, or certainly abusive leadership. But my concern is this: because of these experiences, legit, real experiences, I think we're perhaps too quick to throw the leadership baby out with the tyrannical bathwater, right? There's a wisdom here in what and what Aaron and Hur do that recognizes that leadership is a real thing. It's a role, no doubt. Moses is not some sort of special human being. He's not perfect. He certainly doesn't always make the right call. Those aren't his qualifications. If he has any qualifications, if it's right to talk about it this way, it's simply that he's called by God to play a particular role. But that's important. He has a role, and Aaron and Hur see this. So they're unwilling to kind of just do away with it and say, okay, never mind, this whole leadership thing is just a dumb idea. Let's try some other strategy. Let's put together a machine to keep the rod up in the air, and then we'll always win. And yet, at the same time, they also avoid a second mistake, which would be to see the leader as an isolated figure who has to bear alone the responsibility given to him or her by God. They don't just say, well, Moses is the leader. It's his calling and his job to make it happen. And they don't accuse Moses, at least they don't this time, accuse Moses of being incompetent. That's actually a large part of the grumbling. So that does happen. Text doesn't seem to be a fan of that plan. Rather than kind of accusing him of his incompetence or you're too old for this job, they give him help. Kind of obvious. But they help him carry what only he can actually carry. The staff is his to hold, but they can carry his arms. And as a result, that which threatens the people of God is overcome. And the image is just so beautiful. It reminds me of actually a scene from The Lord of the Rings, which hopefully we're going to get set up here in a second. When Sam, Frodo's dear friend, says to him in The Lord of the Rings when he's lost his strength trying to carry the ring to the fires of Mount Doom, John, I'm going to need your help to cue that up. Oh, you know this is going to be great. All right.
Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. Come on!
Gotta love it. Okay, did you catch the line? Right? I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. I know. I actually think the whole Lord of the Rings is mostly about Sam. If you think, well, he's my favorite character, so maybe that's why I think that. I can't, poor, that's not a very flattering picture of Sam. Let's let him come down. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. What a beautiful picture of leadership in community. Leadership as one role among many in community. And let me tell you, I think this is actually a model that I think we embody pretty well here at ECV, actually. As someone who's been a leader here for a good while and in various sorts of roles, I've been so blessed to have people around me support me, carry me when I can't carry what is mine to carry. And just this past week, I was telling some divinity school students about my experience of leadership here in ECV. And I'm particularly telling them about a season a couple of years back when Hannah and I were just in over our heads. I was serving as lead pastor here while writing my dissertation and teaching a course in Yale College, and it was too much. And our marriage was suffering, and our daughter was taking some of the heat, and we just went to some of our friends and said, our friends here in the church, and we just said what we were up against. We just told them. And the response was extraordinary. There was no condemnation, certainly no kind of buck up, you can do more, but also no scolding for having taken on too much, which was like a legitimate mistake that we had made. I mean, that was like no doubt. But just incredible generosity and care for us as people. Immediately, a team was formed, and those around us began carrying us and carrying what they could carry. It was extraordinary. And you could just see, as I told this story to these divinity school students, you could see their eyes get wide. They were like, that's what leadership is like in your community? Is that what leadership could look like? You failed, and they just helped you put your life back together? right? I mean, these are people facing like ordination boards and committees that are trying to convince people that they're kind of worthy of providing professional services to religious communities, right? Blown away. Like, that's what leadership could look like in the church? It's amazing. So let's continue to love one another this way. We should be asking, how can we support one another in our various roles in our community? How can we lift one another up so that we as a whole community can contend against that which would threaten our very existence as the people of God? Right? The second story actually has a similar theme. This time, the help comes in the form of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Amazing. Father-in-law comes to the rescue. Jethro comes out to kind of see Moses. You get a sense that like people around are aware that there's like a couple 100,000 people hanging out in the desert. And so Jethro comes out. I mean, you can kind of imagine this. Like, did you know that your son-in-law like has like a bunch of people out in the desert? He may be in over his head. Like, you should go see what's up. And that's kind of what he does. Like, Jethro comes in, and he tells him, Moses sits down, tells them about all these amazing things that God's done, and Jethro tells him that's fantastic. Praise God, literally, praise God, right? That the Lord has done these amazing things to you. This tells me so much about who God is, who the Lord is. Wow, I'm for you. That's great. And then it says this. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answers, because the people come to me to seek God's will. And whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions. What can I do? This is my role to play, I think. There was this burning bush, and I don't know. Like, ever since then, it's been a bit of a whirlwind. But here's how. I don't know. This is how we are, right? You kind of get that way, and we've been through something like substantial, like with the Lord. Sometimes it takes a moment to kind of realize, like, take a look back, like, oh yeah, I don't know. I haven't had time to think for a long time. Thanks for giving me some perspective. And this is amazing how practical this is. Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you, not just you and these people who come to you will wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. It's not good for you. It's not good for them. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice. Good father-in-law, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Yes, you have a role to play. You're not wrong. But, look, select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy people who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you." And some practical advice, right? It's actually one of those times actually, having been in moments like this is not too obvious. Trust me. There are times in life where that kind of advice is actually precisely what one needs. But it's nothing revolutionary, right? The community gathers around Moses to help him carry what they can carry. But I want to draw your attention to something in particular. What is this role that Moses is carrying and others are now going to share in? What is it that necessitates this building of this mutually supporting leadership structure? It showed up a couple times already in the passage and a couple of more times in the text that I ellipsed. It's disputes, disagreements among the people, disputes against God, we may presume, from what we've read so far, right? In other words, it's grumbling. And grumbling. The people, as we've seen, are overwhelmed with grumbling, and now they're overwhelming Moses as well. And so it's not just threats from without, right? It's not just the Amalekites coming knocking that require this community of mutual support and clear leadership. It's grumbling. It's threats from within that also threaten this community and require it to structure itself in a particular way. In fact, recalling what we learned last week about the fact that we are always both the people of God and the enemies of God, we can look back at the story of Aaron and Hur holding up Moses' arms so that God will prevail against that which would destroy the people, and we can see the people supporting Moses as he mediates God's judgment on their own enmity. They are helping Moses contend for them against their own worst selves. And it only works because they have already made the decision, a decision which they dangerously revisit again and again. But they've already made a decision to submit to the leadership of God, mediated through the people of God, through the community of God. That's right, I said submit. And that may make us uncomfortable, but if I'm honest, when it comes to actually rooting out sin, the stuff that rots my life from the inside, when it comes to actually rooting that stuff out, this is exactly how community in the people of God has worked for me. I participate in a community, I build up its structures, I support its leaders so that when I am given to forget God's faithfulness, doubt God's goodness, when I'm inclined to fall into temptation yet again, when I make bad decisions about where to invest my time, my energy, my money, that same community of relationships I've invested in is there to contend against me in my contending against God. That community is there to contend against me in my contending against God. That same community is there to save me from my worst self. And so as Jethro and Aaron and Hur and the leaders of tens, 50s, and hundreds stand with Moses, they at the same time stand against themselves in their own grumbling, in their own rebellion, in their own enmity to God. And we too, as we invest our energies in the people of God, in the particular sort of community that God calls us to become, with particular sorts of practices of leadership, of confession, and repentance, we are actually investing in networks of relationship that when they're working right, at least, they mediate to us God's judgment and liberation. Recall that from last week, we actually need both. We're investing in what will help us walk with God for the long haul. These days, we'd say it this way. We are investing in the church, building up the church, so that the church can, at times when we need it, contend against us as we contend against God. I actually had a pretty profound experience with this summer. I was involved and have been involved at various times in the kind of national leadership of our denomination. And I was asked to give some input into some things that were going on. And gave my input, talked with various folks, people I love, people who love me. And they thanked me for my input and did quite differently. And I remember kind of processing that and praying about that and kind of wondering, like, what does one do in this circumstance? And I felt quite clearly the voice of God say to me, Matt, you're part of the church. And sometimes that means you're going to have a voice, but not a say. Are you sure? Like, I don't know, it seems kind of like un-American. Like, right? Like, no, Matt, it's okay. This is the church. And sometimes you're going to have a voice, but not a say. And it's good for you to have a voice, but not a say sometimes. It's actually how I'm forming you. You should receive the blessing that it is that you have a group, that you're actually not on the hook for some of these things. You have people, you have leaders who are leading this community that you're a part of, this broader national and international community that you're a part of. Be grateful for that. Live into that. And that's actually been the kind of theme. Someone was asking me the other day, what's God been doing in the last 6 months of your life? I feel like what God's been kind of teaching me is to celebrate and really enjoy being able to submit to leadership. Being able to kind of say, hey, this is part of how God leads me. As I put myself in structures where I'm going to be constrained by the people around me. I'm going to do what I wouldn't otherwise do. I'm going to be forced to think about things I wouldn't otherwise think about. But I'm going to be shaped, I hope, if it's working right, if the Spirit's actually at work in this church, that would be with a capital C, then I'm going to become more like Jesus in the process. And I think ultimately that's the key to walking with God for the long haul. After or in between the fireworks, we don't do it alone. We don't do it by opting in when we like to. A community with leadership which we support and in which we participate. We live in a community to which we contribute, a community which from time to time, no doubt, functions to save us from ourselves. It's a serious thing we're doing when we do church. It's a serious thing we're doing here, folks. It's a serious thing to be the people of God. But it's also a joyful thing, a liberating thing, a beautiful thing. And I'm personally, I was telling someone the other day, I'm like in love with church these days. I'm so glad to be doing this thing together, right? All of us together, being church before God and before one another. A couple of questions for reflection this week. First, where in your life do you need to practice more gratitude for the gifts that God has given you? Where are you tempted to grumble? As I suggested, I think from time to time this is in part because we just kind of get used to the provision of God in our lives. Anyway, right? Do you see that? Yeah, bread one day, miraculous. Bread every day, starting to count on it. Not that we can't count on God, right? But we should be grateful, right, for God's regular provision. Okay. Second, whose burdens might God be calling you to help carry? There are all kinds of different kind of leadership roles in this community, all kinds of different roles, period, in this community and others I'm sure that we participate in. We should be looking out for one another and looking for opportunities, looking for times when we're called on to kind of carry burdens for someone else, or to carry them as they carry what they're doing. Often, right, it doesn't look like I'm taking over someone. It can look like saying, hey, can I pray for you? Can I support you? I hear you're working hard on that. Can I go grab you some dinner? What can we do? And we do these things for one another. I think we should press in on that. Third, what might it look like, this is the hard one, to submit to God's leadership through God's community in the church? As I said, it's been something that God's kind of been pressing on for me and something I've been growing in and learning. But it's been so freeing, right? So freeing to realize, I am served by a community where I don't carry everything. There are other people who carry things. Other people who have responsibilities I don't. All right, we can, I think, actually press into that and receive it as a blessing. As we reflect, we're going to do so through receiving communion. So if the worship team wants to come forward. Communion is an opportunity for us to reflect on the fact that God has in fact called us, we who were his enemies, nevertheless called us his people, pursued us in love. And when we come, we encounter actually the provision of God for us. Jesus, when celebrating a festival that remembered God's miraculous provision of manna in the desert, and talking about the bread of life, the bread of heaven, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. So I would invite you, if you're a follower of Jesus, or if you'd like to become a follower of Jesus, as the worship team begins to lead us into a time of worship and song, I'd invite you to come forward and to tear off a piece of the bread of life, Jesus himself, his body broken for us, and to dip it in the cup, his blood poured out for us. Just as a way of saying, Lord, I trust that you have what I need. You are our hope, Lord. You are our provision. Provision of the daily bread that we need. the basic things of life, the sustenance that we need, provision of the people of God when and as we need them. So Holy Spirit, come, have your way in this place. Would we encounter you in the bread broken? Would we encounter you here in this place? Knit us together, make us a people, make us your people. Give us the courage to live before one another and with one another in that way that you describe as the way of the people of God. Come and have your way.